Hello and welcome to Earthfile. I'm Ayola Kasim. Ministers issued Marrakesh Action Proclamation on Thursday of the second week of COP22. This came a lot earlier than many have anticipated. Well, the proclamation reaffirms the commitment of 196 countries who are parties to the United Nations Climate Conference to implement Paris Agreement. Today on Earthfile, we bring to you the details of that proclamation as well as other stories that highlight week 2 of COP22. So stay with us. On Thursday, the 17th of November, the head negotiator and Moroccan ambassador to the United States called on the almost 200 governments involved to strengthen and support efforts to eradicate poverty, ensure food security, and to take stringent action to deal with climate change challenges in agriculture.
We call for the highest political commitment to combat climate change as a matter of urgent priority. We call for strong solidarity with those countries most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and underscore the need to support efforts aimed to enhance their adaptive capacity, strengthen resilience, and reduce vulnerability. We call for all parties to strengthen and support efforts to eradicate poverty, ensure food security, and to take stringent action to deal with climate change challenges in agriculture. We call for urgently raising ambition and strengthening cooperation amongst ourselves to close the gap between current emissions trajectories and the pathway needed to meet the long-term temperature goals of the Paris Agreement.
World temperatures are set to hit the highest since records began in the 19th century this year, beating 2015, triggering a melting of ice sheets, damaging coral reefs, and spurring heat waves. In the COP22 document, rich nations reaffirmed a goal of mobilizing $100 billion in climate finance from both public and private sources by 2020 to help developing countries.
We call for an increase in the volume, flow, and access to finance for climate projects alongside improved capacity and technology, including from developed to developing countries. We, the developed countries, reaffirm our $100 billion mobilization goal. We unanimously call for further climate action and support, well in advance of 2020, taking into account the specific needs and special circumstances of developing countries, the least developed countries, and those particularly vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. We who are parties to the Kyoto Protocol encourage the ratification of the Doha Amendment. We collectively call on all non-state actors to join us for immediate and ambitious action and mobilization, building on their important achievements, noting the many initiatives and the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action itself launched in Marrakesh. The transition in our economy is required to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, provides a substantial positive opportunity for increased prosperity and sustainable development. The Marrakesh Conference marks an important inflection point in our commitment to bring together the whole international community to tackle one of the greatest challenges of our time. As we now turn towards implementation and action, we reiterate our resolve to inspire solidarity, hope, and opportunity for current and future generations.
The Paris Agreement seeks to limit a rise in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius by slashing greenhouse gas emissions. The election of Donald Trump to the United States presidency has cast a shadow over the Paris deal, which was agreed after more than 2 decades of deadlock about how to tackle global warming and entered into force in record time on November the 4th. Trump has called man-made global warming a hoax and has said it will withdraw from the Paris Agreement, which seeks to win the global economy of fossil fuels this century with a shift to renewable energies such as wind and solar power. Thursday's proclamation, a political statement of intent with no legal force, affirms plans to cut greenhouse gas emissions blamed for rising world temperatures and causing more downpours, heat waves, and rising sea levels. Moroccan King Mohammed VI, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change hosted state leaders and government officials from all over the world joined the 22nd High-Level Conference of the Party segment on Tuesday, the 15th of November. The opening day segment included the reading of the Call of Marrakesh, which is a call to action that is the result of a highly inclusive consultative process among the parties.
We should celebrate, but we should also reflect on how to now accelerate climate action. At the very center of our work lies the vital need to make climate action a cornerstone to the transformation to truly sustainable development. This must guide us as we build a low-emission and resilient world. We must strike a balance between the needs of societies and the need for a healthy planet. Finding this harmony will protect the one planet we all share and depend on. It will promote prosperity and the well-being of people, especially the most vulnerable. Excellencies, this profound transformation will not be easy and will involve difficult decisions. Leadership is needed now more than ever, and the contribution to this transformation by business, subnational governments, indigenous people, youth, women, and many others cannot be overlooked.
The French president told the United States President-elect Donald Trump that the Paris Accord on climate change is irreversible and that the United States will be affected by rising oceans and natural disasters.
Les États-Unis,
the United States, the largest economic power in the world, the second largest greenhouse gas emitter, must respect the commitments they have undertaken.
qui ont été pris, peut également lancer.
I also want to launch an appeal for perseverance. We have set ourselves the goal of limiting the increase in global temperatures to below 2 degrees and, if possible, 1.5 degrees.
En-deçà de 2 degrés, et si possible.
I can assure you here, we need to step up the pace. We need to step up the pace so that we can implement the Paris Agreement more quickly.
Pour que nous puissions mettre en œuvre l'accord de Paris plus vite qu'il n'a été prévu.
The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, meanwhile, believes the action on climate change has become unstoppable. He says with global cooperation, the world can achieve more.
Now we have to translate these words into concrete and effective policies and actions. This is critical to protect our planet, safeguard the most vulnerable, and drive shared prosperity. Low-emission development and climate resilience will advance all the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted September last year by you distinguished leaders of the world. The United Nations will help countries implement this agreement. The quicker we act, the more we gain.
President Muhammadu Buhari also joined other African leaders at the summit. They have been talking about their commitment to ensuring a sustainable climate. They are also touting their domestic efforts aimed at achieving tangible results in the fight against climate change.
We have reflected our determination for green growth in my country's ambitious intended national determined contribution. We have also announced our plans to reduce emissions by 20% by the year 2030, with the intention of raising this target to 45% with the support of the international community. This is one of Africa's most ambitious intended national determined contributions, convening all emissions from all parts of the economy. This commitment comes from the recognition of the grave social, economic, and environmental threats that climate change poses to humanity. In Nigeria, for example, the impact is being felt by more than 2.1 million people displaced by devastating floods that the country has continued to suffer since 2012.
On Wednesday, African leaders gathered at a separate summit in an effort to reach agreement on key climate issues and present a united front. The goal is to combine African efforts to fight climate change and build a sustainable, clean energy future. Many of Africa's poorest countries are also the most vulnerable, and few have sufficient plans in place. One of the key climate change developments has been the readiness of countries to embrace both knowledge and technology sharing. There have already been examples of that across Africa, but the main stumbling block remains financial.
When you take a look at the amount of resources that we actually have in Africa, it's immense. You take a look at what has happened with the global, with the pension funds in Africa. It's about $334 billion a year. That's how much they're worth. If you look at the sovereign wealth funds, about $164 billion. And so the resources are actually there in Africa. Remittances coming to Africa is roughly about $57 billion. And private equity funds on the continent is about $62 billion. So the resources are there in Africa, and we've got to make sure that we mobilize this a lot.
The French president and the United Nations chief, Ban Ki-moon, also attended the summit, which took place alongside the COP22 climate change conference in Marrakesh. Mr. Ban said Africa was at the forefront of the fight against climate change, and that 36 of the 50 countries most affected by global warming are African.
I encourage all sectors of society to get involved. We need everyone, and we need action from the local to the global. Partnerships should focus on results today and make progress for the long term. We have no time to waste and much to gain by acting now. With the climate impacts accelerating around the world, we need to prioritize adaptation alongside mitigation in the action agenda. I am pleased to see so many African countries mobilizing climate action. Our host, Morocco, has worked with an alliance of some 30 African countries and major development institutions to spearhead the adaptation of African agriculture initiative. I am grateful and admire, with respect, the leadership and commitment of His Majesty King Mohammed VI to mobilize such global and regional action on climate change. This partnership will help create more resilient food systems on the continent and advance the Sustainable Development Goals. I have launched several partnerships on cities, resilience, private finance, and more, all support sustainable development. These are just some of the many areas that show great promise. Each of them is stimulating innovative ideas.
And the Senegal's president said African countries would wait until 2020 for promised aid from developed countries to fight global warming. An agreement during last year's climate talks in Paris provides for a green fund of $100 billion per year from 2020 to help poorer nations make the shift to clean energy. The French president said Wednesday's summit will lay the foundations for the plan to help Africa from 2020. African leaders have called for more funding from developed nations to cut fossil fuel emissions and take contingency measures. The UN, too, has called for more money, especially for adaptation, shoring up defenses against the effects of global warming. This could mean building dikes or elevating homes as protection against rising seas, improving weather warning systems, and growing climate-smart resistant crops.